The year was 1177, and fear hung over Jerusalem like a dark cloud. The holy city stood vulnerable, surrounded by enemies and weakened by political divisions. Rumors spread through crowded markets and narrow stone streets that a massive invasion was coming from the south. Merchants packed their belongings, mothers held their children close, and priests filled churches with desperate prayers. Every citizen knew the name of the man leading the approaching storm. Saladin. Saladin had united powerful Muslim territories under one banner and now marched toward Jerusalem with an army so enormous that survivors claimed the desert itself trembled beneath their horses. 26,000 soldiers advanced across the burning sands, carrying banners that stretched across the horizon. Village after village surrendered or burned as the army moved closer to the kingdom's heart. Inside Jerusalem, many nobles believed the battle was already lost. Their king, Baldwin IV, was only a teenager suffering from leprosy. The disease had already begun destroying his body. His hands were often wrapped in cloth, and pain followed him every waking moment. Some advisors begged him to stay inside the safety of the city walls, while others quietly discussed surrender. But Baldwin refused to hide. Despite his illness, the young king summoned every knight he could gather. Only around 500 knights answered the call, along with a small force of exhausted soldiers. Compared to Saladin's overwhelming army, they seemed hopelessly outnumbered. Yet, Baldwin rode before his men, wearing polished armor that concealed his failing body. His face looked pale and weak, but his voice carried strength that silenced every doubt around him. "If we fear death more than dishonor," he told them, "then Jerusalem deserves to fall." The knights raised their swords and shouted in loyalty. Against impossible odds, the sick young king prepared to ride directly toward one of the greatest armies in the world. As Saladin marched deeper into the kingdom of Jerusalem, confidence spread throughout his enormous army. His commanders believed victory was already guaranteed. Scouts reported that King Baldwin IV had only a tiny force remaining, far too small to stop the invasion. The Muslim army moved carelessly across the land, spreading out over miles as soldiers looted villages and celebrated what they thought would be an easy conquest. Saladin himself felt certain that Jerusalem would soon belong to him. He had defeated powerful enemies before and united vast territories under his rule. Against 26,000 experienced warriors, what threat could 500 knights possibly pose? Meanwhile, Baldwin pushed his exhausted men across harsh desert roads under the burning sun. Every movement caused pain through his diseased body, but he never allowed his soldiers to see weakness. Wrapped tightly in armor, he rode at the front while priests marched beside the army carrying sacred relics. The most important among them was believed to contain a fragment of the true cross, the same cross upon which Jesus had been crucified. For Baldwin's soldiers, the relic became a symbol of hope. Many believed God himself marched beside them. Though terrified, the knights slowly transformed their fear into determination. They knew they were hopelessly outnumbered, but retreat meant watching Jerusalem burn. As the army approached the plains near Montgisard, Baldwin received shocking news. Saladin's forces had become scattered while searching for food and plunder. Thousands of enemy soldiers were separated from one another, leaving gaps in their lines. The young king immediately recognized the opportunity. Ignoring the warnings of cautious nobles, Baldwin ordered an immediate attack. His commanders stared in disbelief. Charging directly into an army 50 times larger seemed like madness. But Baldwin understood something his enemies did not: a smaller force moving with speed, faith, and surprise could still destroy a giant. And at that moment, Saladin's mighty army was completely unprepared for what was coming. The morning air over Montgisard felt heavy with dust and tension as King Baldwin IV prepared his tiny army for battle. Before them stretched the scattered forces of Saladin. Thousands of soldiers spread carelessly across the plains. Some were resting, others searching nearby villages for supplies, never imagining that the Christians would dare attack. Baldwin gathered his knights on a small rise overlooking the battlefield. Priests stepped forward carrying the sacred relic of the true cross high above the soldiers. The sight of it silenced every fearful whisper among the men. One by one, knights lowered themselves to their knees in the dirt. Many believed this would be their final day alive. The young king slowly removed his helmet. His face showed the marks of sickness, and his body trembled from exhaustion. Yet his voice remained calm and powerful. "Today," Baldwin declared, "we fight not because we are strong, but because we have no choice." The knights rose with renewed courage. Fear still lived inside them, but something stronger now burned beside it. They knew they were defending their homes, their families, and Jerusalem itself. Then Baldwin gave the order. Trumpets roared across the plains as 500 armored knights lowered their lances and charged forward like a thunderstorm of steel. Horses pounded the earth so violently that dust exploded behind them in giant clouds. The sudden attack shocked Saladin's scattered soldiers, who scrambled in confusion trying to form battle lines, before many could even prepare their weapons. The Crusader knights smashed directly into them with devastating force. Shields shattered, spears splintered. Men were thrown beneath charging horses as panic spread rapidly through the Muslim ranks. Saladin's commanders shouted desperately for order. But confusion had already turned into chaos. The massive army that had marched toward Jerusalem with absolute confidence was suddenly fighting for survival against an enemy they had underestimated. And at the center of the charge rode Baldwin himself, the sick young king, leading his men straight into impossible odds. The battlefield at Montgisard exploded into chaos as the knights of Baldwin IV tore through the scattered army of Saladin. What had begun as a confident invasion suddenly became a desperate struggle for survival. Dust filled the air so heavily that soldiers could barely see through the storm, created by galloping horses and crashing steel. The Crusader charge hit with terrifying speed. Baldwin's knights moved like a single unstoppable wall, cutting through isolated groups of enemy soldiers before they could regroup. Muslim warriors rushed to form defensive lines, but confusion spread faster than commands could travel. Officers shouted conflicting orders while frightened horses crashed into fleeing men. Saladin watched the disaster unfold in disbelief. He had expected the Christians to hide behind Jerusalem's walls, not launch a direct attack against overwhelming numbers. Worse still, many of his soldiers were scattered miles apart, gathering supplies and looting villages, leaving the army dangerously unorganized. Baldwin pressed the advantage. Without mercy, despite the pain tearing through his diseased body, the young king remained near the front lines. Witnesses later described him riding fearlessly through the fighting, while carrying himself like a warrior chosen by destiny. His presence inspired the exhausted Crusaders to fight with incredible fury, again and again. The knights charged into larger enemy groups, breaking them apart before they could stabilize. The sound of clashing swords mixed with screams, prayers, and the thunder of hooves. Fallen banners disappeared beneath clouds of dust and blood-stained sand. Soon panic swept through Saladin's army. Rumors spread that the Christians had far more soldiers hidden nearby. Fear replaced confidence as entire units began retreating without orders. What should have been an easy victory for Saladin was turning into complete humiliation. Realizing the battle was slipping away, Saladin attempted to rally his remaining forces. But the momentum now belonged entirely to Baldwin and his tiny army. Against impossible odds, 500 knights were crushing one of the most powerful armies in the world. As the battle raged across the plains of Montgisard, the army of Saladin began collapsing under waves of fear and confusion. Soldiers who had marched toward Jerusalem with confidence were now fleeing in every direction. Some abandoned their weapons entirely, while others desperately searched for commanders who had already disappeared into the chaos. The Crusader knights showed no signs of slowing down. Led by Baldwin IV, they continued striking isolated enemy groups with relentless force. Every successful charge shattered morale further. Dust and smoke covered the battlefield, while screams echoed across the burning plains. Saladin fought desperately to restore order. He rode through the confusion, calling his men back into formation, but panic spread faster than his commands. Many soldiers believed they had fallen into a massive ambush and feared even larger Christian armies were approaching. The more the Muslim lines weakened, the more terrifying the Crusader attack appeared. Then disaster struck Saladin personally. During the retreat, his bodyguards were forced to pull him away from the battlefield to prevent capture or death. According to later accounts, the great Sultan barely escaped with his life. His once proud army had completely disintegrated, leaving thousands dead or scattered across the desert. The retreat soon turned into a nightmare. Exhausted soldiers fled south through harsh terrain with little water or protection. Many died from wounds, hunger, or dehydration before reaching safety. Horses collapsed beneath the desert heat while abandoned equipment littered the roads for miles. Meanwhile, Baldwin's exhausted knights stood victorious against impossible odds. Few could believe what they had accomplished. A teenage king suffering from leprosy had defeated one of the most feared military leaders of the age, using only a tiny force of loyal warriors. As news of the victory spread across Jerusalem, church bells rang throughout the city. Citizens poured into the streets, celebrating what many considered a miracle from God himself. The Battle of Montgisard became legendary almost instantly, proving that courage, leadership, and timing could overcome even the greatest numerical disadvantage in history. The victory at Montgisard echoed across the Middle East like thunder. News spread rapidly that Baldwin IV, the sick teenage king suffering from leprosy, had defeated the massive army of Saladin against impossible odds. In castles, markets, and royal courts, people struggled to believe the story. 500 knights had shattered an army of 26,000 and forced one of history's greatest commanders into retreat. Inside Jerusalem, celebrations filled the streets for days. Church bells rang constantly while priests declared the victory a divine miracle. Soldiers who survived the battle were treated like living legends. Citizens crowded around them, desperate to hear how such a small force had survived the storm of war. Yet Baldwin himself understood that the victory was only temporary. Though triumphant, the young king's body continued to weaken. Leprosy slowly stole his strength year after year. Some days he could barely hold a sword or mount a horse without assistance. Still, he continued, ruling Jerusalem with determination, refusing to surrender his kingdom while he remained alive. For Saladin, the defeat became a painful lesson. He realized he had underestimated both Baldwin and the fierce resolve of Jerusalem's defenders. Rather than destroying his enemy quickly, the crushing loss forced him to become more cautious and disciplined in future campaigns. Years later, Saladin would eventually return stronger than before. After Baldwin's death, the balance of power shifted dramatically. Jerusalem would fall to Saladin in 1187 following the catastrophic Battle of Hattin. But even then, the memory of Montgisard refused to fade. Historians continued telling the story for centuries because it seemed almost impossible. A dying teenage king, crippled by disease, had ridden directly into one of the largest armies of his time and achieved a victory that stunned the world. The Battle of Montgisard became more than a military triumph. It became a symbol of courage against hopeless odds, proving that determination and leadership can change history even when defeat appears certain.